Have you ever been listening to a creepy ghost story or haunting history, and you're like, damn, this is so enjoyable, but I wish my friends were here so we could experience it together? That's us, Gina and Catherine, and we'll bring the snacks when you join us on I Scream, You Scream, the podcast where we serve up chilling stories with a side of our favorite ice cream.
Every month, we pick a new flavor of ice cream and a new topic to go along with it. Werewolves, poison, cemeteries, you name it. From deep dives into stories we all thought we knew to your real-world experiences, at this ice cream party, we always get to the bottom of the bowl.
Cozy up with us every Tuesday for your weekly scoop of the most chilling histories, mysteries, and paranormal perplexities. Until then, keep it cool.
And keep it creepy with I Scream, You Scream, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Did you know you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon, where by joining, even at the free level, you can receive exclusive member benefits, like ad-free episodes. A special shout out to Salazar Slytherin, Jorge, Alexandra Garcia, Sunlocks, Taylor, Ben Graham, Darren Elquist, Yana G, and Tony Edmiston for joining the Red Treehouse Patreon family. To subscribe, simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. According to Andy Williams, Christmas is, quote, the most wonderful time of the year, end quote. And for many people, that's true. It's a time for family, food, celebration, and presents. But for many, it's the exact opposite. And for a family in West Virginia, Christmas 1945 turned out to be not only the worst time of the year, but also one of the most tragic. Because on Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, the Sodder family of 12 suffered a horrifying tragedy, a fire that destroyed the family home. 6 of the 12 made it out safely. 1 was not home at the time of the fire, and the remaining 5 children were never seen again. And to this day, over 80 years later, it's one of the most horrifying and unexplained disappearances in history. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the scary and mysterious disappearance of the Sodder children. What happened to them on Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, 1945? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse.
When it's time to scale your business, it's time for Shopify. Get everything you need to grow the way you want. Like, all the way. Stack more sales with the best converting checkout on the planet. Track your cha-chings from every channel, right in one spot. And turn real-time reporting into big-time opportunities. Take your business to a whole new level. Switch to Shopify. Start your free trial today.
George Sodder, originally Giorgio Sadu, was born in Sardinia, Italy in 1895. At the age of 13, he emigrated to the United States with his older brother. Though for reasons unknown, his brother returned to Italy almost immediately after processing at Ellis Island. George, on the other hand, remained in the U.S., where he eventually found work in Pennsylvania as an assistant to those working on the railroads. A few years later, he became a driver for a small company in West Virginia. and within a short time after that, started his own trucking company, at first carrying fill dirt to construction sites, and then hauling coal. It was around that time when he met Jennie Cipriani, who, like himself, had emigrated from Italy. The two married in 1922 and settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, in a small town with a large population of Italian immigrants. A year later, in 1923, George and Jennie had their first child, John, and George's trucking company prospered. And though George was well respected by many in the community, his strong and opinionated personality sometimes alienated people. And more specifically, his strong opposition to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini set many Italians within the community on edge. From 1923 to 1942, George and Jennie had 10 children. John, born in 1923, Joe, born in 1924, Marion, born in 1926, George Jr., born in 1929, Maurice, born in 1931, Martha, born in 1933, Louis, born in 1935, Jennie, born in 1937, Betty, born in 1940, and Sylvia, born in 1942. By the early 1940s, the United States was embroiled in World War II, and both John and Joe were sent overseas to fight. In July 1943, Mussolini was overthrown and immediately arrested. However, a few months later, he was set free by German forces, and it would be another 18 months before he was rearrested and ultimately executed by Italian resistance fighters. These details are important because, as I mentioned, George Sodder was an outspoken critic of Mussolini. In October 1945, a month or so after Mussolini's execution, a life insurance salesman visited the Sodders, who for their part weren't interested in purchasing insurance. Spurned, the salesman made an ominous threat, warning George, quote, that his house would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, end quote. The salesman further claimed the threat was on the basis of George Sodder's, quote-unquote, dirty remarks about Mussolini. Sometime later, a visitor seeking work commented to George that a fuse box would, quote, cause a fire someday, end quote. George was taken aback by this, because he just had the house rewired after he installed an electric stove. As fall turned to winter, and the Christmas season approached, George's older sons claimed they observed a strange car parked along the main highway in town, with the unknown occupant seemingly spying on the Sodders' younger children. Christmas Eve 1945 started out as a joyous day. Marion, 19 at the time, was working at a small store in downtown Fayetteville and had purchased gifts for 3 of her younger sisters. The girls pleaded to stay awake past their bedtime, which Jennie, their mother, agreed to. George, John, and George Jr. were already asleep, having spent the day working, and Jennie instructed Maurice and Louis to put the cows in and feed the chickens before turning in for the night. She then took Sylvia and went upstairs to bed. A few hours later, at approximately 12:30 a.m., now early Christmas Day, Jennie received a phone call and spoke briefly with a woman whose voice she didn't recognize and who was asking for someone whose name she didn't know. Jennie politely told the woman she had the wrong number and took note of the woman's strange laugh. She hung up and prepared to return to bed, but in doing so, noticed the lights were still on and the curtains wide open. This was odd, because the children would have taken care of this prior to going to bed themselves. So, she turned off the lights and closed the curtains and went back to bed. A few minutes later, at approximately 1 a.m., Jennie was startled from sleep by a loud bang on the roof, followed by a rolling noise. She waited, but didn't hear it again, and ultimately went back to sleep. 30 minutes later, she woke up in a panic because she now smelled smoke. Jennie jumped off the bed and found George's office on fire, and it seemed the likely source was the telephone line outside and the fuse box. Jennie woke up George, who then woke up his oldest sons. As the fire spread quickly, George and Jennie frantically yelled to the children to wake up and leave the house immediately. By the time the house was consumed, only 6 of the 11 escaped. George, Jennie, Sylvia, John, Marion, and George Jr. Joe was not at home as he was serving in the military at the time, but Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, who were asleep in the attic and who could not be reached because the stairway was aflame, did not make it out of the house. George, in an attempt to save his children, tried to climb the outside wall and intended to use a ladder to reach the attic. But when he and his sons went around back, the ladder was nowhere to be found. He then tried to pull both of his trucks up to the house and use them to climb into the attic window, but neither of them would start. Tragically, the Sodders could do nothing more than watch as the house was engulfed in flames, leading to a full collapse approximately 45 minutes later. They assumed their 5 children perished as the house was overtaken. Of course, this leaves us with a logical question. Where was the fire department? According to various accounts, the local fire department was short on manpower because of the war effort, and they were relying on individual firefighters contacting each other in the case of an emergency. Unreliable phone service contributed to an already tough situation, and it was hours before help showed up to the already burned down Sodder home. Remember, the fire started at approximately 1:30 a.m., and the fire department didn't show up until well after 7:30 in the morning. The investigation into the fire began almost immediately, and the Sodders were told to leave the site undisturbed so the state fire marshal could conduct a more thorough investigation. 4 days later, though, George bulldozed over the site, hoping to turn it into a memorial garden for the lost children. Death certificates were then issued for the 5 children on December 30th, 1945, and the funeral service, which George and Jennie did not attend due to overwhelming grief, was held on January 2nd, 1946. After the investigation determined the fire was caused by faulty wiring, and as the Sodders did their best to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives, questions arose, leading them to reconsider the investigation's findings. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. With the tragedy behind them, the Sodders tried their best to rebuild their lives, but the strange details of that night nagged at them. The investigation determined the fire was caused by faulty wiring. But remember, Jennie Sodder found the downstairs lights on and the curtains wide open, and she turned them off before going up to bed. If faulty wiring caused the fire, how had the lights remained on, even while the fire was blazing through the house? And the ladder that should have been at the back of the house, where had it gone? When George and his sons went back there, it was nowhere to be found. But investigators determined it was approximately 75 feet away from the house and at the bottom of an embankment. Something interesting. A telephone repairman claimed the fire had not burned through the telephone line entirely, but rather had been cut by someone who climbed nearly 15 feet and reached over 2 feet to do so. Neighbors quickly identified a man who they claimed stole a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire. He was subsequently arrested and admitted to both the theft and to cutting the telephone line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. Decades later, Jennie commented that if he had successfully cut the power line instead of the phone line, the fire would have spread too quickly for any of the family to get out of the house alive. Regarding the missing children, the investigation determined that the fire burned hot enough to destroy all remnants of their bodies. But Jennie questioned this, comparing a similar house fire that killed a family of 7, and where skeletal remains of the victims were found in the rubble and ash. After the fire that claimed the lives of the Sodder children, no skeletal remains were ever found. As part of her personal investigation, Jennie Sodder spoke with an employee of a local crematorium, who stated, quote, that even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, human bones remain visible, end quote. And what about the trucks that failed to start as George and his sons tried desperately to reach the attic? George believed someone may have tampered with them, causing engine failure. All of this leads us to the same question. What happened to the 5 Sodder children on Christmas 1945? Theories abound. As winter turned to spring, George and Jennie planted flowers in the memorial garden at the side of the house. But within a few months, more questions arose. Specifically, that the fire wasn't caused by faulty wiring, but possibly by some kind of explosive device. A bus driver passing through town that night claimed she saw someone throwing, quote, balls of fire, end quote, at the Sodder house. Remember, Jennie was initially startled out of sleep by a loud bang on the roof of the home. And Sylvia later found a small ball-like object in the brush close to the house. Unfortunately, there was no way to confirm these claims. Perhaps most shocking were the eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children after the fire. One woman, quote, who had been watching the fire from the road, said she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning, end quote. Another woman claimed to have served them breakfast later that morning. She worked at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. The Sodders quickly hired a private investigator and were stunned to learn the insurance salesman who threatened George over his anti-Mussolini comments was also on the jury who determined the fire was caused by faulty wiring. And there was something else. One of the firefighters on the scene was Jennie's brother, and he claimed no remains were found. But rumors around town claimed he had admitted to finding a heart among the ash, and that he had placed it in a metal container and buried it. George, wanting to confirm this, tracked down the minister whom Jennie's brother had confessed to, and the minister confirmed the rumor. George then confronted Jennie's brother Morris, who admitted to finding a heart, placing it in a box, and burying it. The two then dug it up, and sure enough, there was some kind of flesh inside. George took it to a local funeral home, where the director determined it was beef liver and that it had never been exposed to fire. Morris confessed that he placed the beef liver in the box in the hopes the Sodders would find it and be content that the children had perished in the fire. A few years later, while looking in a magazine, George spotted a group of ballet dancers, one of whom looked like his daughter Betty. He traveled from West Virginia to New York City in the hopes of seeing her, but was ultimately refused when he requested to meet. He also pleaded with the FBI to consider investigating the case as a possible kidnapping. Famed FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover responded personally, stating, quote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau," end quote. In late 1949, George convinced a Washington, D.C. pathologist to dig around the side of the house for anything that might be helpful. He found several artifacts, and what appeared to be several small bone fragments. These were sent for testing, and it was determined that they were in fact human vertebrae, all from the same person. Further examination determined the individual died sometime between 16 and 22 years old. Except this didn't match the ages of any of the 5 children, as Maurice, who was the oldest to perish in the fire, was only 14 at the time. It was later determined the bone fragments likely came from a nearby cemetery or burial plot. In 1950, 5 years after the house fire, the state of West Virginia closed the investigation, and the FBI, having later decided it may have been an interstate kidnapping case, closed their investigation after pursuing limited leads. To their credit, the Sodders never gave up hope of finding their children. And as time passed, and the hope of finding additional physical evidence became less likely, at least 2 theories rose to prominence. Of course, these theories are alleged explanations rooted in speculation, not in fact. For some time after the fire, eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children. One person claimed they had checked into a hotel with various adults speaking Italian. Others claimed they spotted the children at a tourist location some 50 miles from the family home. But when they attempted to speak to the children, the adults accompanying them refused to allow it. Others believed the mafia was involved with the possible disappearance. Remember, George Sodder was an outspoken critic of Benito Mussolini, and many within his own community disliked him because of it. Over time, the family considered the possibility that the children were kidnapped as retaliation. Except, there has never been any concrete evidence of this, leaving everyone searching high and low for answers. Then, in 1967, George Sodder traveled to Houston after receiving a tip from a woman who had written to the family. She claimed a man had revealed himself to be Louis Sodder, who was only 9 years old at the time of the fire. According to the woman, the man claimed he and Maurice were living somewhere in Texas. George traveled to Texas to try and speak with the woman, but was prevented from doing so. However, police were able to find the 2 men, but they denied being Louis and Maurice. Then a few months later, Jennie received a letter in the mail, postmarked from Kentucky with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man in his 30s. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie." The physical similarities between the man in the picture and the men in the Sodder family were uncanny. Dark hair, dark eyes, and chiseled features. The family hired a private investigator to go to Kentucky, except he never reported back, and when they went to search for him, they could not locate his information. Despite this, the picture gave them hope. Even though they had no credible evidence Louis, or any of the other children, were still alive. George Sodder died in 1969, and Jennie Sodder in 1989, both fully believing their children did not perish in the house fire. The remaining siblings have all since passed away, with Sylvia, the youngest, having died in 2021. In a 2013 interview, she stated, quote, "I was the last one of the kids to leave home." End quote. She, like her parents, believed her siblings survived the house fire that night on Christmas 1945. And today, nearly 81 years after the tragic fire, the case remains unsolved. For me, cases like this are among the scariest and most harrowing. As a father, there is nothing worse than the possibility of losing a child. And while I can only empathize with George and Jennie Sodder in their tragedy, I can say that this would be the absolute worst nightmare come to life. As for the determination about what happened to the Sodder children, I can't say what I think definitively, because there are compelling theories on both sides. The most logical is that they died tragically in the house fire, that it spread so quickly and burned so hot, there wasn't much time or much chance of escape. But it is plausible that something more nefarious occurred at the Sodder home. And while the alleged kidnapping is purely speculative, is it possible someone kidnapped the children in retaliation for George's political views? Some might say this is unrealistic, but truly, we don't have to look far or listen to the news nowadays to see the consequences, and at times tragedy, for speaking out against tyranny. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering question. What happened to the Sodder children in December 1945? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.